And the odd thing now in retirement, I quote at the beginning of my first book, the wonderful René Leriche thing about every surgeon has an inner cemetery. It's a place to which he or she has to go from time to time. But now in retirement, all I see is the cemetery. I mean, he's not there all the time, but I just am very preoccupied about all the mistakes I made.
In an emotional way?
Yeah, I get terribly upset sometimes, and I get to forget. I remember some of the cases, and
when did it come to you?
Sweat. An awful lot suddenly reappeared when my advanced prostate cancer was diagnosed. When I was waiting 2 or 3 weeks to get the results of the scans to show if I had Mets or lymph nodes, which I didn't at the moment. And then I remembered all sorts of cases I'd completely forgotten.
Right.
Why suddenly becoming a patient myself had this profound jolt, I don't know. But what I do feel very strongly is that now if you've made lots of mistakes, as I made, and I was often very impatient and a bit hurried and also doing too much operating, making decisions too quickly, you have a serious responsibility to try to lecture and teach about it, which is what all my lectures when I go abroad are all about. And I illustrate them with patients I've harmed. And I think that's very important. I think all senior surgeons have this enormously important duty with their colleagues and their trainees to be as honest as they can be, which is very difficult about making mistakes.
And did you ever find people attacked you for that honesty?
Only once in Ukraine, when you shouldn't be telling patients all this, you'll be out frightening patients. To which I said, well, this is a paradox. If as a patient you have to trust a doctor, how can you trust a doctor if he's not honest? So it is kind of paradoxical. But again, it was easier for me to write my books. First one was published before I retired, and I wanted to do it before I retired, but I was already pretty senior and well known by then. Yeah. I couldn't have written that book at an early stage of my career. That would have been impossible.
Right.
What I found very helpful, and I read Kahneman's book on thinking fast and slow and all the literature and cognitive biases, it's because we have these biases. They distort all surgical decision making, whether it's pre-op or post-op, is about probabilities. They're not simple sums or facts, it's probabilities. And when we estimate probabilities, all sorts of emotional, unconscious factors can influence us. If you have good colleagues, and the solution to all my disasters, in theory, would have been if I'd discussed them with colleagues. If I had colleagues I liked or trusted, they'd have taken one look at the scan. Look, Henry, that's a subdural empyema. They wouldn't have had my emotional self-defensive.
But at that time, it was only you, and it was a very small team, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. So it was difficult. Yeah. But it would have, some of the mistakes, I had some better colleagues later on, and I should have asked. So I feel passionately as good surgery is all about having good colleagues and getting away from the sort of heroic individual, which certainly was how I saw myself when I
Trainees can be very good sometimes.
Oh, absolutely, very much so, exactly. Often asking dumb questions,
So how should M&Ms be conducted?
Well, that's a big problem, and I've sat in on lots, both in this country and abroad. It it depends on two things. It has to be led by a senior person. I think the tradition often, which happens, certainly in America, you get the chief resident presenting the cases. But then, is it the attendings either all hate each other and criticise, or that it all gets brushed under the carpet, and to create a sort of positive, we're all going to learn from this, is very difficult. And you're never going to get people to be honest about mistakes. I think by setting an example about being very honest about your own mistakes.
Yeah. So it's about leadership then.
I think it's about leadership. I think that's you can't expect people to. You have to create a safe atmosphere where it's not having a sort of unit-wide audit with all the cleaners and the physios there is ridiculous. It has to be for surgeons. It has to be for surgical team, and the senior doctor or doctor must, should always be very, very open about mistakes they've made to set an example. Then it becomes much, much easier. But you can't just say no. Point point the finger at people and tell them to confess, you know. You have to start by confessing yourself.
Yeah.
I've certainly sat in M&Ms where lots of juniors' mistakes have been brought up, but the consultants don't admit to much bigger ones.
Exactly. And all the juniors present the cases and then on a slag off the consultants.
They do
No, I think with M&Ms it is essential that the consultants present their own cases. It should not be done by the juniors, is my own view.
Yeah.
And they should be, well, you have to try to create, and there has to be leadership. There has to be one person conducting it. And that person has to have shown they're very willing to be open about mistakes they made themselves. Easy in my case, I've made so many. So when I'm teaching in the morning.
Yeah, I think people do make mistakes. And if you're proactive, then those mistakes in a way are easier to see than if you avoid work.
Yeah, sure. And also, I mean, the first thing about a mistake is to admit it to yourself. Then it's whether you admit it to colleagues, and finally whether you admit it to patients. And those are three separate things. As I was talking to